Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the History Cloak channel. I'm Mr. McGee. On today's episode, we are going to take a look at the third branch of government, the Judicial Branch. Now, Article 3 of the Constitution is the smallest of the articles dealing with a branch of government, but that's not to say that the Judicial Branch is not important. In fact, it is very important, and it tends to be the one that students, and not just students, but adults alike, seem to know the least about. Most people have an idea of the executive branch because they know the president. Most people know a little bit about their legislatures because they've learned in school fairly early about how a bill becomes law. But most people only know that there's a Supreme Court, but they don't actually know anything else about how the judicial branch functions or what its powers are. But luckily, that's why we're here. So, we're going to take a look at the judicial branch today, and hopefully you will know more than you did before you started. So ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. Now, Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution states that judicial power shall be invested in one Supreme Court and in other inferior courts that Congress can create. So I want you to think about that. The Supreme Court is created by the Constitution, but Congress is given the power of creating the lower courts. Now, if you remember from last episode, I showed you this. This picture shows the hierarchy of the courts. Of course, you have the Supreme Court at the top, but then the next level down is the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. After that is the U.S. District Court. What's interesting is that most people only know that top level. They don't realize that there is a Circuit Court of Appeals or district courts or how they work. So, I want to show you a map. Now, when you look at this map, the best way to understand it is to think about the three levels of courts that you saw earlier. The Supreme Court has power over all 50 states and the U.S. Commonwealth. So in other words, whatever ruling comes down from the Supreme Court affects all of the country. Now, the United States Court of Appeals, they have power over a certain group of states. So for instance, if you notice the 8 and the states that are in orange, well, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals has power over North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, and Arkansas. So when they make a ruling, it only affects those states that it has power over. Now let's take a look at Iowa. You notice that Iowa has a line through it and it says Northern and then Southern. Well, the U.S. District Court of Appeals, that third level of the federal court system, they have power only over a certain section of a state. So for instance, the Northern Iowa U.S. District Court only has power over the northern part of Iowa. The Southern District Court of Iowa only has power over the Southern District Court. Now you may be asking yourself, hey, wait a second, Nebraska doesn't have a line through it. Well, that means Nebraska has one district court. And that one district court affects the entire population of Nebraska, not just a section of Nebraska. Now that you've seen the map of the court system of the United States, let's take a look at an actual case and see how that case would actually work its way through all three levels of the federal court system. So let's take a look at the Supreme Court case, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. I picked this Supreme Court case because it's a well-known Supreme Court case around the country. It overturned the 1972 abortion case, Roe versus Wade. Now I want us to take a look at how does this case work its way through all three systems of the federal courts. Now the state of Mississippi passed a law banning abortions after 15 weeks. The Women's Health Organization of Jackson, Mississippi challenged that. So they went to the Southern District Court of Mississippi. The Southern District Court of Mississippi ruled in favor of the Women's Health Organization, thus striking down the Mississippi law. Now the state of Mississippi now has an option. They can either accept the ruling or they can appeal up to the U.S. Circuit Court. So the state of Mississippi appealed up to the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is located in New Orleans, Louisiana. Now, as we said earlier, the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals, they have power to hear all district cases coming from Texas, Louisiana, or Mississippi. The 5th Circuit Court of Appeals heard the case. They ruled against the state of Mississippi and for the Women's Health Organization. Now, the state of Mississippi has one last appeal they can appeal up to the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court does not have to hear a case that's appealed up to it. If the Supreme Court decided not to hear the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization case, then the ruling of the Fifth Circuit Court would be the ruling that Mississippi would have to follow. Now, it happens that the Supreme Court opted to hear the case, so the case was appealed up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the state of Mississippi, upholding the 15-week ban on abortion. So, not only was Mississippi able to pass that law, but because the Supreme Court's ruling affects the entire United States, that meant that all 50 states and the Commonwealth could also pass abortion bans. Hopefully, you now understand the process of how a case will work its way up to the Supreme Court. Now, before we leave Section 1 of Article 3, we need to mention that it also says that judges have to be paid, and their pay cannot go down while they're in office. So there's no way to influence the judge by saying, ooh, I don't like your ruling, so your salary goes down next year. Also, a judge may stay in office as long as they exercise good behavior. In other words, they can't commit any felonies. As long as they do that, they have a job for life. This is important because you don't want a judge making rulings because, they have to be elected in 2 years, so I'll make a ruling so that it will be popular with the people. You want a judge who will just look at the Constitution and make a ruling based on whether a law is constitutional or not. Now, some of you may be asking, hey, how do you actually become a judge at the district level or the Court of Appeals level or the Supreme Court? Well, if you were paying attention to the last 2 videos, you will remember that the president has the power to nominate judges to all 3 of these levels. In fact, that is the only way you can become a judge on any of these 3 levels is by a presidential nomination and the Senate confirming the president's nomination. So, the president could nominate me to be a judge on the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, but unless the Senate confirms me, which they wouldn't because I have no law degree nor have I practiced law, then I would not be a judge. One little side note, can you name any of the Supreme Court justices? By the way, justice means judge. Now, I'm asking this question because most people can't. Most people can barely name 1 justice on the Supreme Court. So, for learning's sake, let's take a look. So, starting from the back left, we have Amy Barrett, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, Ketanji Brown Jackson, Sonia Sotomayor, Clarence Thomas. By the way, Clarence Thomas has served on the court the longest out of all 9 justices. You have Chief Justice John Roberts, you have Samuel Alito, and you have Elena Kagan. Now, you may not be able to know all the judges on all the circuit courts or all the U.S. district courts, but it is important to know the 9 justices of the most powerful court in our land. On to Article 3, Section 2. Article 3, Section 2 basically states that our judicial system has power to rule over all things involving the Constitution, laws that are created, or treaties made. Now, Section 2 goes on to talk about all the different combinations of cases like citizen versus citizen, or state versus state, or state versus citizen, or the U.S. government versus citizen. It basically lists all the types of cases that the judicial branch is allowed to hear and has power over. Now, I'm not going to go through that whole list, but you can read it for yourself. But it is important to note that when it comes to cases involving ambassadors or government officials, the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction. In other words, that case immediately goes to the Supreme Court. Other than cases like that, the Supreme Court acts as the court of last appeal. Like when we talked about Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. The Supreme Court was the last place you could appeal to. But if we have ambassadors or government officials, it goes to the Supreme Court immediately. Section 2 also states that all crimes, with the exception of impeachment, must be tried by a jury. Now, by the way, as a criminal, you do have the option to forego a jury and just have your case tried by a judge. But it starts out as if you'll have a trial by jury unless you waive that right. Now, also, all crimes have to be tried within the state they are committed. So, if there's a case in Nebraska, obviously it cannot be tried in Tennessee. Also, if a crime does not take place within a state, then the place where the trial will take place will be decided by laws that Congress puts in place. Now, Article 3, Section 3, which is the last section of Article 3, actually deals with treason. It seems kind of weird because we've talked about the creation of the Supreme Court and we've talked about the jurisdiction of the judicial branch, but Section 3 is all about treason. In Section 3, you can only be guilty of treason if you have fought against the United States of America or you have aided the enemies of the United States of America. Now, with treason, there are only two ways to be convicted. Either you have to have at least two witnesses who can testify to the same act. So it can't be, well, one witness noticed this act over here and then another witness noticed a completely different act. You have to have at least two witnesses to the same act. Or, if you confess in open court, then obviously you'd be found guilty as well. Now, Section 3 also states that while Congress has the power to determine the punishment for the person that commits treason, that punishment cannot transfer to their kids. So if there's a financial punishment, the kids do not have to pay that financial punishment. Also, there is no corruption of blood. So in other words, the person who committed treason is found guilty, but their kids are not guilty because they are related to the person who committed the crime. Now, there are 3 other articles to the Constitution that deal with various things like how do we add an amendment to the Constitution? Also, the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, how does that work? And also the responsibility of the United States government to pay debts that were incurred before the United States became a country. All of those are important to read. I'm telling you about them because, again, I want you to go to the Constitution and read them for yourself. Now, there are 27 amendments that have been added to the Constitution over the history of this country. The first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights. Now, my goal was to focus on the first 10 amendments because the states were not even willing to ratify the Constitution without those first 10 being passed. Now, in the comments section below, I want to hear from you whether you would like me to make a video after I do the video on the first 10 amendments. If you'd like a video on the other 16 amendments, I'll probably break it into 2 sections. But would you like me to do a video on that and kind of talk about those other amendments that maybe don't get talked about too much? If you don't, then we'll move on to other subjects involving current events, but if you'd like me to, please let me know. Now, if you have any other comments besides the comments I'm asking you about, please leave them politely and respectfully in the comments section below. I'm Mr. McGee. Take care.